Good morning, everybody. I think we have enough to hold over the Inspector General Access Act and Corey T. Wilson, United States Circuit Judge for the Fifth Circuit. To my colleagues, we'll take up the Inspector General Access Act next week. Got a call from Mr. Horowitz and the Justice Department and Senator Lee trying to find out if we can find an accommodation to get everybody on board. If not, we'll vote next week. And Mr. Wilson will be held over the circuit judge for the Fifth Circuit. Okay.
Now you can do an opening statement.
I tell you what, we got two matters on the agenda. Mr. Walker, the United States District Judge for the District of Columbia, and the subpoena authorization. I don't know if we have enough to do business yet, but I thought I'd make a bit of an opening statement here. Here's where I'm going and what I'm trying to accomplish. I thought it was important to give Mr. Mueller the space to complete his job. I thought a special counsel needed to be appointed after Comey was fired. Not that I doubted Comey was lawfully terminated, but Jeff Sessions was a member of the Trump campaign, and the accusations were that the Trump campaign was colluding with the Russians, for lack of a better word, and Mr. Rosenstein picked Mr. Mueller to conduct that operation, and I supported that. I was very glowing in my comments about Mr. Mueller. I admired what he's done for his country and think he's a good man. So the report has been completed, and he was able to do his job, and the results are out, and you can read the report for yourself. But here's what's happened. Mr. Horowitz, who's the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, was able to find that during the course of the Mueller investigation, that there were 17 irregularities when it came to seeking warrants against Mr. Carter Page by the Mueller team, Crossfire Hurricane, and eventually the Mueller team. It was so bad that the court issued an order that Senator Hawley read yesterday. Now I won't go over it, but it's a rebuke of the FBI by the FISA court that's stunning. We're not going to retry the Mueller investigation. Senator Grassley, when he was chairman and I was subcommittee chairman, we held a lot of hearings about Russian interference in our election. We called Donald Trump Jr. before the committee. We interviewed people who were in the Trump Tower meeting with the Russians about adoptions and other things. With Senator Whitehouse's help, we issued a subpoena to a bank that Mr. Manafort was doing business with, so I think we took seriously the allegations of Russian collusion and Russian interference in our election. And I want to thank Senator Grassley for holding all those hearings. Now, here's where we find ourselves as a committee. The court has issued a stunning rebuke of the FBI. Isn't it our job to try to find out what happened? Mr. Horowitz said it's inexplicable to him how over 9 months so many errors could have been made. I think I know, but he says it was inexplicable. They were fundamental errors and really bad stuff over a pretty long period of time. I asked him, do you know if the senior leadership of the FBI was aware of the fact that the Russian subsource interviewed in January, who disavowed the dossier, did they know that the warrant application had fallen apart? Because Mr. Horowitz and Mr. McCabe tell us without the Russian dossier prepared by Mr. Steele, who was on the payroll of GPS, who was paid by the Democratic Party, there would have been no warrant. They tried to get a warrant, and they couldn't get it until they found the dossier. And Senator Hawley, I think a few others mentioned, it's pretty stunning that a Russian disinformation campaign could wind its way into the hands of the FBI and eventually get warrants. None of us should ever want that to happen again. So there was involvement in our campaign by the Russians in our election. It wasn't the Ukrainians, it was the Russians. And they played both sides. And what I want to know is the people who interviewed the subsource and found out that it was a bunch of bar talk and hearsay and not reliable, did they sit on it? If they didn't report it up the chain, don't you think they should be disciplined? Because it was exculpatory information. There's a duty of people in law enforcement to disclose to the court and their superiors information that would undercut the case. If they didn't report it up the chain, then I hope they're going to be dealt with, and I can't answer that question. As to the subpoenas, I can't talk to these people. The FBI won't let me talk to the case agent and the intel analyst. I don't know if Mr. Durham's talking to him or not, but I think the committee has an obligation to find out what happened when the Department of Justice and the FBI were put on notice that the central document necessary to get a warrant no longer was reliable. And how do you explain that it was used twice after the January interview, in April and June? And the court was misled. Because in the application it says the subsource was interviewed, he was truthful and cooperative. Mr. Horowitz tells us something different. He found the interview that was the memo, based on the email, that was pretty stunning. Here's the other question. Mr. McCabe. Mr. McCabe said he never misled Mr. Rosenstein. Somebody misled the court. Now, is it possible Mr. McCabe, who was in charge of this investigation on a regular basis, had no knowledge that the dossier was disavowed by the Russian subsource? Maybe so, but I would be shocked if one of the most high-profile cases in the history of the FBI, it didn't make it out of the basement that, hey, our case just fell apart. So if he didn't know, he should have known, and how could he not have known? If he did know, and if Comey knew, and they continued to seek a warrant after they knew the dossier was unreliable, then they should be held accountable either criminally or otherwise. And nobody knows the answer to that question. And we're going to get to the answer to that question. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, I support the investigation into this rogue FBI counterintelligence investigation known as Crossfire Hurricane. But I think what Mr. Rosenstein pointed out to us yesterday, and something we all know from the Department of Justice org chart, is the FBI director is supposed to be accountable to the Deputy Attorney General. And yet Director Comey basically was conducting this investigation along with the Deputy Director McCabe and others. And Sally Yates and Loretta Lynch didn't have a clue what was going on. You remember what Sally Yates' reaction when they talked about the Kislyak-Flynn conversation. She was surprised that there was actually an ongoing investigation. I think it was Crossfire Razor, as I understand, as I recall, as a subset of Crossfire Hurricane. So it occurs to me that in addition to questions I have about the FISA court that I've talked to Senator Lee and others about, and its function, whether it actually serves as a check and oversight on the FBI in counterintelligence investigations, because it basically is a non-adversarial process, that we ought to look at more fundamental issues like, is the FBI the right agency to handle counterintelligence investigations? They are the premier law enforcement organization in the world. But on counterintelligence, particularly where it is completely unsupervised, and where there's so much opportunity for mischief, as we've seen as laid out in Inspector General's report, I think we ought to be asking some of those kind of fundamental questions, and I hope that we can work with you and our colleagues across the aisle to look at all of that, because after 9/11, the FBI took on a whole new role in counterterrorism and counterintelligence matters, and really outside of its traditional wheelhouse. So I just wanted to plant that seed. I haven't thought it all the way through yet. It's just sort of a kernel. But I think we need to be asking some fundamental questions and get some answers. Thank you.
I think you have somebody who is going to be leaving us that you would like to say something about.
Well, thank you very much for letting me take a moment to praise the service of my Chief Counsel, Carter Burwell. Carter came to me after working for then Chairman Grassley, and he served this committee for 6 years. He came to the Committee on Detail in 2014 from the Department of Justice originally, and then joined my staff in 2016, became my Chief Counsel in 2018. Carter's been an invaluable aid to me on national security matters, which is his background as a former prosecutor, reauthorization of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, privacy and technology matters like the Backpage Bill, FOSTA, and SESTA, and criminal justice issues like the First Step Act that I'm proud that we've been able to accomplish together. And he's also, he and my Judiciary Committee staff have done yeoman's work on judicial nominations. Yesterday, we just filled the last vacancy to the federal judiciary in Texas with the confirmation of Drew Tipton, 21 new Texas judges under this administration. Carter won't be going that far. He'll be going over to help Secretary Mnuchin at the Treasury Department on national security matters and on our economic recovery. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Carter for his service, not only to my office and me personally, but also to the committee. Take a bow.
Knowing Senator Cornyn the way I do, I'm sure you're getting a pay raise. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin with this, and I'm going to take a few minutes. I think it's important to note that the committee has never heard from Mr. Mueller and his team. Yesterday, you questioned Mr. Rosenstein about whether there was any there to justify investigating possible ties between the Trump campaign and Russia. I wrote you a letter signed by every Democrat on this committee on May 8, 2019, that says we're writing to you to follow up on our request. This is a follow-up, that the committee hold a hearing with Special Counsel Mueller regarding his report on Russian electoral interference and obstruction of justice. The Mueller report is a seminal document that caps the special counsel's nearly 2-year investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. As comprehensive as the report is, it is clear that there are many outstanding questions that remain unanswered. The attached document identifies at least 60 unanswered questions related to both Russian interference and obstruction of justice. We believe that Robert Mueller would be best suited to answer these and other questions. I would like to put this in the record, Mr. Chairman. We asked for this over a year ago, and there was no answer to our plea. So now I want to address the chair's authorization for subpoenas.
Could I just make one comment?
Sure.
The reason, well, you could read the Mueller report for yourself, I guess, but Mr. Mueller is a great patriot, served this country for a long period of time. I'm not adverse to having somebody from the Mueller team come and tell the committee what they did and how they did it. As a matter of fact, I think that's a really good idea. I'm not so sure Mr. Mueller would be the best person now, but maybe Mr. Wiseman. But I think, I agree with you. I think we need to understand how the Mueller team worked, and I am very open to getting somebody from the Mueller team over here during the course of our inquiry. So I just want to let you know that that's not an unreasonable request.
Well, thank you. We sent you this letter over a year ago asking for Mr. Mueller. I think Mr. Mueller is a man of extensive brain cells and can well recall the situation. I think this side would very much like to have him here, so I'll just leave you with that. Today, I want to address the chair's authorization for subpoenas. Our committee rules provide that a subpoena can be issued by the chair with the agreement of the ranking member or a vote of the committee. In this case, neither was done. The chair's motion is, in a sense, an end run around committee rules. It does not require either the ranking member's agreement or a vote on a specific subpoena. Instead, it would give the chair sole authority to issue hundreds of subpoenas. This removes the minority from any role in the issuance of a subpoena. This leads me to believe that this is a move to grant the majority total control over investigations and prevent the minority from gaining information in crucial areas. This would allow the majority to present a one-sided, selective account of the facts, and we oppose that. With this motion, the chair is granted unbridled authority to issue subpoenas for literally any document or witness related to Crossfire Hurricane, the early stages of the FBI's investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. It also allows subpoenas for 53 officials named in the motion, the vast majority of whom served under President Obama. Using a single motion to authorize subpoenas for 53 people and possibly hundreds more documents and witnesses is unprecedented in this committee. I asked my staff to search committee records to find just one comparable example. They could not find a single instance where this committee has authorized subpoenas for 53 people in a single vote. In addition, the committee has not been provided with explanations for why any of these people have been listed. For example, why is Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew on the list? Or Steve Ricchetti, Joe Biden's chief of staff, who is currently a senior advisor on Biden's presidential campaign? Why is he on this list? John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chair, is also on this list, even though he has already testified twice before the House Intelligence Committee, and the transcripts of his testimony are publicly available. And we have been given no explanation as to why Samantha Power, former ambassador to the United Nations, warrants a subpoena from this committee. Put simply, this motion, and I'm sorry to say this, but I believe it, grants the chair unbridled authority to go after Obama-era officials. I can't support this kind of dragnet authority to conduct politically motivated investigations. And I urge my colleagues on both sides to consider carefully whether we want to set this as a precedent going forward. In my time on this committee, which is well over 20 years, we have always been careful about the use of subpoena authority. We've required specific explanations of what information is being sought, why we need it, and whether this compulsory process against any specific individual is truly warranted. In fact, our rules are designed to ensure that the committee issues subpoenas following bipartisan consultation and cooperation, and we have historically done so. Our last subpoena was 3 years ago, in 2017, when Chair Grassley and I agreed to subpoena Paul Manafort. In 2007, the committee authorized several subpoenas by voice vote to White House and Justice Department officials involving the U.S. Attorney firing scandal. With the ranking member's consent and following a bipartisan vote, we also authorized subpoenas concerning the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping program. And Chairman Leahy's 2008 authorization of legal counsel's torture memos followed years of bipartisan efforts to obtain those materials. I must say, the chair's motion is a significant departure from this tradition of bipartisan cooperation, and I'm really surprised. And once the door is open to proceeding in this manner, to allow the chairman sweeping unilateral authority to subpoena political opponents, that door remains open regardless of which party has majority power. I take great exception to the chair's subpoena authorization and will oppose it. And the second part of this is on Justin Walker, which I'm happy to put in the record, but let me say this personally, Mr. Chairman. I have great belief in what this committee does. We have always considered both sides. Since I've been on it, and I've been on it, I've been here 26 years. It was Joe Biden that asked me to go on it when he was chairman. And to see us do this in this way, with a bulk list of subpoenas, not knowing why anybody on this list is actually being subpoenaed, I think opens this committee to enormous concern and, yes, even criticism. So I'm very sorry we're at this day, but on our side, we have to stand up and we have to fight this because it sets a very poor precedent that has never existed before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. I'm going to say something real quickly, Senator Lee.
Yes.
Now I'll respond.
I want to thank you for the hearing we held yesterday with Mr. Rosenstein. I thought it was enormously helpful and beneficial. I also thought it was something that shows front and center the need for FISA reform. What we saw yesterday is that that system that we've been assured now for a couple of decades is not working well, and it doesn't self-police. This is one of the things that happens when you have a secret court with secret litigants, when in most circumstances, absent further reform, you can't even have an amicus curiae in there participating. We need to pass something at least as strong as the Lee-Leahy amended version of the FISA bill a couple weeks ago, which the Senate adopted by a vote of 77 to 19 along strong, overwhelming bipartisan lines. What we heard yesterday from Mr. Rosenstein only further confirms the need for aggressive FISA reform. It's at least as strong as what we adopted with Lee-Leahy. This enterprise that's involved in FISA and the agents that we heard about yesterday really were abusing the law. These are every American's civil liberties that are being undermined, not just Republicans, not just Democrats. Everyone's civil liberties are potentially at stake when they can use the apparatus of FISA to go after someone. And yes, some of these improper investigations were themselves politically motivated, and we have to get to the bottom of them to figure out what happened. It is essentially important, regardless of what happens with those investigations, that we conclude them by updating and reforming our laws. These laws have proven far too easy to manipulate, and we must not allow them to wither on the vine. I'm grateful to Senator Leahy, with whom I've worked for many years on this issue. Senator Leahy and I spotted the risk of abuse of this shortly after I arrived in the Senate, and he and I embarked on a journey together to try to reform this. It does need to happen. Last week, something significant happened. The reforms we passed in the Senate died. They weren't able to secure a passage. For the first time in history, these were the most aggressive FISA reforms that we've ever adopted in either house in the history of FISA. And for the very first time, these very reforms stalled, not because they didn't do enough to help the government, but because they were perceived by many to not do enough to restrain government. This is the right direction. We need something at least as aggressive as the Lee-Leahy amendments we passed a few weeks ago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, do I understand we are debating?
That's what I was going to ask. Do you want to do Walker first or the subpoenas first?
Mr. Chairman, I defer to the chairman of the committee.
If you don't mind, could we do Walker first and then we'll talk about this? Is that okay?
I'd like to make a statement about Mr. Walker.
Absolutely. So let's turn to Walker. It will come back to this.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Feinstein's statement on Mr. Walker's in the record.
Mr. Chairman, when it comes to the nomination of Justin Walker to the D.C. Circuit, the second highest court in the land, can we be honest for a moment here among ourselves? Can anyone here say with a straight face that this 38-year-old individual with no practical courtroom experience and a few months on the job as a district court judge in the Commonwealth of Kentucky is the best person for this job? Anybody? He's not, and we know it. Justin Walker is in line for this lifetime appointment to the second highest court in the land for two reasons. He's a family friend of Senator McConnell, and he's an outspoken critic of the Affordable Care Act. Justin Walker has made it clear that at any cost, he is willing to toe the Republican Party line in opposition to Obamacare. Before he was a judge, he called the NFIB case that upheld ACA's constitutionality, quote, an indefensible decision. And he even cracked jokes about his opposition to the ACA at his investiture ceremony in March while he was still a sitting judge. These comments apparently put him on the fast track to the D.C. Circuit. It is astonishing to me that Senate Republicans have chosen to pick so many obvious opponents, not just opponents, but people who are hostile to the Affordable Care Act in the nominations they brought before this committee. John Bush, Steve Graz, James Ho, David Porter, Naomi Rao, Mark Norris, Michael Trunkale, Sarah Pitlick, to name a few. Not to mention Chad Riedler, who filed the brief for the Trump Justice Department in Texas versus U.S. case that called for striking down the entire ACA, including protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. The case is now pending before the Supreme Court. Chad Riedler was nominated to the Sixth Circuit within a day after filing the brief. We are seeing this pattern again with the Walker nomination. Even in the middle of a pandemic, the Republican Party of America is not stopping its attack on the Affordable Care Act, and yet it has never, underline never, produced a substitute or an alternative. So why were we brought back here 5 weeks ago with a nation that was being told to stay at home, with the District of Columbia with orders for people not to be out and about? Why did we convene the Senate, bring back 10,000 employees at risk to themselves and their families? We brought them back for this nomination. It was the first item of business. Justin Walker, former intern to Senator McConnell, to go to the second highest court in the land. Mr. Chairman, I've said it before and I repeat it. There have to be, among all of the people in the United States of America, a conservative Republican judge with the qualifications for this court. This man is not that person, and we all know it. Make no mistake, the nomination of Justin Walker is not only a personal favor to the Republican leader, it is a direct attack on the Affordable Care Act in the midst of a public health crisis in America. I oppose this nomination.
Senator Leahy, I think.
I have a statement on this nomination, which I'll put in the record.
Without objection.
I completely concur with what Senator Durbin said. His statement sets it out very clearly. I also concur with what Senator Lee said. And on the issue he's talked about, he and I have worked very, very closely with many senators, both Republicans and Democrats. And I hope we can get that back online. I think we had, I'd ask the senator from Utah, how many votes did we get in the Senate? 77 votes. It's hard to think of, as polarized as become around here, to have 77 votes to say the sun rises in the east. We got 77 votes on our amendment. And I would hope that everybody can step back, take a deep breath, put it back in and go forward. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not going to speak at length because I've made this point repeatedly, but the Washington Post has reported that there is a multi-$100 million network funded by anonymous donors at work trying to manipulate the makeup of our federal courts. When we faced the Merrick Garland versus Judge Gorsuch contest, and then the problems with Judge Kavanaugh, political campaigns against Garland, for Gorsuch, and for Kavanaugh were run by an organization that were paid for with $35 million in 2 anonymous donations. There's every reason to believe that the 2 anonymous donations came from the same donor. There's certainly no reason not to believe that. So what you have is somebody who spent $35 million to influence the makeup of the United States Supreme Court, and we don't know who they are, and we don't know what business they had before the court. We see repeat performers who are funded by anonymous donors bringing cases before the court, and in cases of political import, we see choruses of amici turn up who, upon investigation, turn out to have common funding by anonymous donor groups. The extent to which our courts are now mired in dark money is unprecedented. And if I could, I heard very clearly the chairman's argument yesterday, his belief that in this matter, were the political polls reversed, our Democratic hair would be on fire to get to the bottom of what the hell happened in Crossfire Hurricane. Well, I assert the same argument here. If anonymous donors on our side were picking Supreme Court judges, were funding political campaigns for their nominations, were bringing cases before the court, and were flocking in little flotillas of amici to the court to make arguments in chorus for whatever the donor interests are behind this scheme, would be equally on fire. There is no precedent for this kind of dark money around the Supreme Court. We've seen the mischief of dark money in our politics. That's bad enough. We should have common cause to clean that rot out of our political system. But when it starts to creep into our judiciary, something has gone badly, badly wrong. And I'll close with a connection between this and the matter that we're about to discuss. Because I believe very deeply that if the shoe were on the other foot, the Republicans on this committee would have no hesitancy asking the group that ran the political campaigns and received $35 million in 2 donations to fund those campaigns, who the hell was behind those campaigns? That's a very simple question. It goes to the heart of the integrity of the judiciary, and we can't even begin to get an answer to that. That is the backdrop of lack of oversight. My questions yesterday about QFRs were the same. The letters that have gone into the same bin with our QFRs are the same. And so if we're going to do oversight, by God, I hope we'll do fair oversight and oversight into questions that are different than the questions that the Trump campaign wants us to ask. If all the oversight we do is the oversight that is congruent with the Trump political campaign's interests, that is not a good place for this committee to be. Thank you.
Thank you. And your request for questions for the record, I will call the number 2 guy at DOJ together and say, what's the deal, and try to get these questions answered, because it's important that the committee be taken seriously by those who we regulate. That was a point well made.
Chairman, and you made that point yesterday, and I thank you for that and for this today. I'm very grateful. I appreciate it.
Next week, I promise you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Justin Walker's nomination, which I also cannot support, his record leaves me with real concerns that he won't be able to separate his political beliefs from his judicial opinions, and at a time when hundreds of thousands of Americans have been sickened by COVID-19, Judge Walker has repeatedly attacked the Affordable Care Act and expressed a fervent desire to see it repealed, but frankly, at a time when inspectors general have been fired and independent oversight is being eroded. I am equally, if not more, concerned about statements by Judge Walker that imply he believes the FBI should be nothing more than an agent of the president. I am gravely concerned about an expanding reach of folks in the judiciary who have a view of the executive branch that I think is eroding a lot of precedent and lays a poor foundation for governance in the future. These are just two of the red flags I saw in Judge Walker's record. There's many other talented lawyers who possess the proper judicial temperament who could be filling this position. Instead, I will be voting no. And to the point that Senators Lee and Leahy raised about the FISA bill that added protections to the FISA process that recently passed this chamber, I co-sponsored it. I thank my colleagues for their hard work and leadership. I was proud to see the Senate take action in this area. If there are ways to improve the FISA process, we should explore them seriously rather than the proceeding that's happening today. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this opportunity to speak on the nominee, Judge Walker. You know, I think it is the height of irony that we are potentially about to confirm a judge who has made it his mission to destroy the Affordable Care Act, which is the core of our healthcare system at a time when we are in the midst of a healthcare crisis. Nothing could speak more powerfully to the underlying goal of the entire nomination process, that is to remake the federal judiciary in the image of the far-right extreme of the Republican Party. And it is also driven by those forces that Senator Whitehouse outlined just minutes ago. The dark money that is driving this campaign is on full exhibit today. So I will vote against Judge Walker, not because he was found to be unqualified as a nominee for the district court judge. I believe he's unqualified to be a judge on the appellate court as well, but because he is mission-driven, as he said in his investiture speech when he was sworn in as a district court judge, he would pursue his legal principles, although he said, quote, although my legal principles are prevalent, they have not yet prevailed. That's his goal as a judge, policy-driven goals. And first among them, to destroy the Affordable Care Act and our healthcare system. As to yesterday's hearing, I wish I could believe that even a tangential purpose was FISA reform. I spoke at the testimony of Inspector General Horowitz. I reiterated this point yesterday. I have been doing and proposing FISA reform for years, first under President Obama, now under this president. There are ways that a corrective mechanism can be incorporated into the FISA process, making it more adversarial. Some of those ideas have been incorporated, but by no means enough of them. And so I hope there will be a serious effort toward FISA reform, but that is plainly not the purpose of the hearing yesterday or of the subpoenas that we have been asked to approve. And the effort to deflect attention from that healthcare crisis and the economic catastrophe unfolding before us, I think really is a waste of our time and demeans this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'll just respond to the comment. The hearing wasn't designed to find ways to reform FISA. I think that would be an outcome of what happened. The hearing's designed to find out what the hell happened. This rebuke by the court to the FBI is stunning. I want to know how you could renew a warrant on two different occasions, months apart, when the underlying basis for the warrant fell apart. I want to know why General Flynn got prosecuted after everybody in the FBI who was looking at his case said it should be dropped. I want to know how a lawyer could manipulate an email and nobody know about it. We're trying to bring accountability. That's what we're trying to do. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have spoken out against Justin Walker's nomination in the past, and today I would like to associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues on this side of the aisle. I often hear, why are you Democrats against conservatives? I thought conservatives stood for fairness, at least, but these nominees are conservatives, if we even can apply a word to them. They're conservatives on steroids, set to undo decades of precedent that protects workers and individual rights. And yet, we proceed. I will not be voting for Justin Walker.
Senator Booker, would you? Senator Harris.
Thank you. I joined the comments of my colleagues on this side, and also it is important to emphasize many of the points that have been made, including the fact that this committee is rushing to confirm a nominee for a vacancy that does not even exist. I, again, joined the concerns about Judge Walker, in particular, as it relates to the Affordable Care Act, while we are in the midst of a pandemic. In addition, people of all races are marching in the streets of America, outraged about the racial discrimination and injustices that have taken place over generations. But we have Judge Walker, who has expressed excitement about a judicial confirmation that he believes would lead to, quote, an end to affirmative action. Let's think about the message that advancing a judicial nominee like this sends to all of these communities of color and their allies, particularly at a time when people have taken to the streets to protest the violence and injustice that Black people have faced for generations in America. That is why I strongly oppose Judge Walker. I join with many, many civil and human rights groups, including the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, along with 20 reproductive justice organizations, People for the American Way, the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, the National Council of Jewish Women, the National Center for Transgender Equality, the League of Conservation Voters, the United Steelworkers, the Human Rights Coalition, NARAL, Lambda Legal, and the National Education Association, and of course the NAACP, who opposed Judge Walker's nomination yesterday. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all. On the motion,
We need one more.
where did Senator Tillis go? Okay, on the motion to report Judge Walker for this, what circuit is this? DC Circuit. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
No.
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 The motion is favorably reported to the floor. Thank you very much. So Judge Walker goes to the floor. Now, as to the subpoena authorization, I call up the chairman's June 4th, 2020 motion to authorize subpoena related to Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Maybe I can respond to Senator Feinstein, and we'll open it up for debate and anything y'all would like to do in terms of amending it. Here's what I've come to conclude, that the transition issues are probably better left to Senator Johnson. So I know that there was a request by Vice President Biden to unmask General Flynn. There were some requests by people. Samantha Powers made a lot of requests for unmasking. Maybe there's a legitimate reason, I don't know. But quite frankly, I think our time will be better served to go and look at Crossfire Hurricane and the Mueller report itself. So I don't expect us to be calling people in the transition period. We'll let Senator Johnson do that. So what I do expect us to do is try to find out. Rosenstein said he signed the warrant not understanding that the underlying document, the dossier, had been disavowed, and if he had known that he wouldn't have signed it. That's pretty stunning to me. I want to ask other people that same question. When you signed this warrant application, did you know what had happened? And they may have a good explanation, and we'll say, okay, we're learning here. But if I find one person in the FBI who told the higher-ups that our case just fell apart and they went forward anyway, there's going to be hell to pay. And it will come from Durham, not us. Now, the court sent a stunning rebuke to the FBI about the way they behaved here. And Senator Leahy, you're right. The Horowitz review of FISA warrant applications found a lot of them did not comply with the Woods procedure. That's what you and Senator Lee are talking about. But this is different. This is not a failure to comply with the Woods procedure where you kind of check the homework. This is an effort to conceal exculpatory information from the court and manipulate documents provided to the court. We're talking about criminality here. That's not what Mr. Horowitz found. So what I want to do, I want to find out how this happened and make sure it never happens again. No more, no less. And I can't get access to the people at the Department of Justice who did the interviews. And if I need a subpoena to do that, I will. I hope I don't. In terms of what we're doing here, I asked my staff to look at what the committee's done in the past. And in September 25th, 2008, Senator Leahy issued a subpoena for all things related to torture that passed on a party line vote. This is basically a replication of that. And the people's names I put in there is just anybody I could think of that were related to the unmasking or could be potential witnesses in terms of their participation in Crossfire Hurricane and the Mueller report. As to Mr. Mueller, if you want to call him, I will. I would just ask you think twice about that. If you can find somebody else involved in the Mueller investigation that would serve your purposes, I am very open-minded to calling that person. To the people on our side, what I'm doing has been done before. And it was pretty obvious to Senator Leahy that Republicans were not going to go where he would like on torture. It's pretty obvious to me that our friends on the other side are not going to go where we think we need to go. And the public can judge whether I'm on some cause for Trump or not. I mean, I think I've got a pretty good record of saying, if that makes sense, I'll do it. I can promise you the president wasn't enamored with the Special Counsel Protection Act. And it really is not about that. It is about trying to find out what happened to the point that the FISA court had to rebuke the FBI in such stunning terms. It's trying to find out why people had their lives turned upside down, probably unnecessarily. And I think that's a legitimate thing for us to do. And this subpoena will allow us the power to get to the bottom of it. And I'll always consult with Senator Feinstein. And I don't know what we'll need to subpoena, what documents, if any, but I am intent on trying to find out what happened. So, Senator Feinstein?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would like to introduce an amendment. It's Feinstein, number HEN 20543. This amendment would ensure that the ranking member has the same authority to issue subpoenas as the chairman is granting himself. It also ensures that the committee can obtain information about the decisions made in the Michael Flynn and Roger Stone cases. Mr. Chairman, you yourself noted the importance of minority subpoena rights just last year when you introduced a resolution calling on the House to give the Republican minority, and I quote, equal authority to issue subpoenas and other compulsory process. At the time, you described this as an issue of basic fairness. I think the motion today is really a serious departure from our rules and our practice. I said in my remarks 2 weeks ago, I think it creates unbridled authority to go after Obama-era officials in order to bolster conspiracy theories and denigrate the president's political opponent, Joe Biden. I just put the facts right on the table, ladies and gentlemen. I think if you support my amendment, at least it shows that the committee is willing to follow the facts where they lead and give an opportunity for this side to gain a subpoena, providing the full context surrounding the Russia investigation. It will restore the committee's longstanding tradition of cooperation, lead to a more fair process, and I am hopeful that for all these reasons, my colleagues will support this amendment. Thank you,
Now,
Mr.
recognize Senator Leahy, but I promise you that we're going to call the Department of Justice eventually to inform the committee as to why they decided to drop the case against Mr. Flynn. I think they need to come in here and tell us that. Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to set a couple facts straight. I spoke yesterday on the floor, actually, in many ways, my capacity as Dean of the Senate. All the years I've been in the Senate, I don't know that I've seen America hurting as much as it is today. Racial injustice has reared its ugly head once again with the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police.
I got
On Monday, our military joined federal officers who used rubber bullets, smoke, and tear gas agents to forcefully clear hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans exercising their First Amendment rights next to the White House so that the president could briefly pose for a photo op. The unrest comes on the heels of the Trump administration's inept response to a global pandemic that's taken the lives of more than 100,000 Americans. Our country is sinking to new, once unimaginable lows, seemingly every day. Yet this committee has had little to say about any of that. No legislation on either the pandemic or police reform is before us today. Instead, in the words of Fiona Hill and Senator Whitehouse yesterday, this committee is busying itself with the president's political errands. I've never thought of the Senate Judiciary Committee under either Republican or Democratic leadership as being an political arm of the White House, but I do now because after relentless badgering from the president's Twitter feed, Senate Republicans have relented. We're now poised to unleash the Judiciary Committee's full authorities and resources to chase what amounts to a debunked conspiracy theory. Did the FBI make serious mistakes during its surveillance of a former Trump campaign aide, Carter Page? Yes, and I said so at our hearing earlier this week. And we've held a hearing on that issue. That hearing followed an exhaustive investigation and a 478-page report from Inspector General Horowitz at a time when inspectors general were still allowed to do their work. The Senate then took steps to try to ensure those mistakes would not happen again. including overwhelmingly passing an amendment offered by myself and Senator Lee that would strengthen civil liberties protections in the FISA process and require that exculpatory evidence be disclosed to the FISA court. That, I would submit, is the Senate at its best, shining a light on a thorough and nonpartisan investigation into abuses within an executive agency. And I applaud Senator Lee for holding strong on that. And then crafting and advancing bipartisan legislation to try to ensure such abuses never happen again. That's the Senate that I joined when I first came here. That's the Senate I believe in. That's the Senate at its finest. But frankly, Mr. Chairman, and you and I have been friends for a long time, what we're about to do now is the Senate at its worst. Given what we've already accomplished, what are we doing here today? No number of hearings or subpoenas will change the critical facts before us. Carter Page was never more than a bit player in the Russian investigation. The serious errors that occurred with respect to his surveillance all occurred after the launch of the Russian investigation. Everybody knows Russia did try to interfere in our election. But those errors, Carter Page errors, had nothing to do with Russia's multifaceted attack on our democracy. Nothing to do with the fact that the special counsel found that Trump campaign officials welcomed Russia's criminal intervention and attempted to exploit it, and nothing to do with the fact that members of the Trump campaign then lied to the American people, lied to Congress, lied to the FBI, even lied to Vice President Pence about their contacts and communications with Russia during this time. As I said yesterday, the notion that the special counsel's investigation was not properly predicated, was not worthwhile, is simply outrageous. And pretending otherwise serves Putin's interests more than it does Americans. Now, refer to something that the chairman has said different times. It's been claimed by Republicans that the subpoena authorization on the agenda today simply follows a precedent I set as chairman in 2008. That's false. That's balderdash. What the committee did then and what it's doing now could not be more different. During the Bush administration, this committee worked for over 5 years to obtain a limited number of OLC documents and opinions related to the Bush administration's torture policies. Republicans and Democrats worked for that. And for 5 years, the administration stonewalled these requests, including the request of the then Republican ranking member of this committee. And a month before seeking subpoena authorities, after 5 years of trying, not 5 days or 5 hours, but 5 years, ranking member Specter joined me on a final request that detailed our years-long effort to obtain the set of documents. And this committee was stonewalled again. I still did not seek subpoena authority until the very last executive business meeting of the Bush administration. That was a subpoena of last resort. It was our last chance to learn what secret detainee and interrogation policies the White House was operating under. The authorization could not simply list the handful of documents the committee is aware of. It had to apply to documents related to our narrow investigation because the administration has spent the last 5 years hiding those documents from us. They refused to even provide us with an index of relevant OLC documents. At the last markup, the ranking member said he shared my concerns about the legality of the OLC opinions at issue, and he shared my frustration at being rebuffed by the Bush administration for 5 years, over 5 years. Now, he ultimately did not support a subpoena, but neither he nor any Republican suggested I not go for it. In fact, several, and some here will know, told me quietly they were for it. He noted that we'd have a new president in a few months. Perhaps we'd have more cooperation with an incoming administration. I disagreed that the committee should have to wait for and take its chances with the new administration. So we obtained the authorization. I then issued a single solitary subpoena for the same documents the Republicans and I had long sought, and the committee finally obtained them. And that's what congressional oversight looks like. To my knowledge, no chairman of this committee has sought authority to issue subpoenas without any effort to make it bipartisan. No chairman has ever sought such subpoena authority as a first resort. No chairman has sought a limitless authorization to subpoena what could be. I understand the chairman has talked about some limitations, but could be literally hundreds of individuals and literally millions of pages of documents. And frankly, and I thought I'd never have a time I'd say this with either Republicans or Democrats in charge, no chairman has devoted the full weight of this committee's resources to pursue a wholly partisan investigation to benefit a presidential campaign. Such an authorization makes a mockery of our committee rules. It sets a dangerous partisan precedent. It will represent a new low for this committee, a committee we all hold dear. And because of that, I will vote no. And in doing that, I think of my years and the number of chairs and ranking members I've served here with. This is not an easy thing to say in a committee I love, a committee I first asked to go on the day after I was elected to the Senate. So I just want everybody to know, and I will admit that I'm a little bit annoyed when somebody suggests that I did this before, which of course I didn't. Not 5 years of discussion for one subpoena. And then to have Republicans at that time say, well, you go ahead. I would note one other thing on that, and even after President Obama, even after the election, and he'd been elected, I still put through onto the floor with bipartisan support a number of Bush judicial nominees. I compare that to the low of this committee when we had a Supreme Court nominee. This should have been considered in the last year of the Obama administration, especially when it was someone that a number of members of this committee had said, of course, they'd be glad to vote for. I yield the floor.
Thank you. Senator Kennedy, I think you want to speak, but just if I can respond. I know you're frustrated, but so am I. Let me tell you why I'm frustrated. Senator Coons came to me, I think with Senator Booker, and said, listen, Trump's saying some pretty wild things about Mueller and the Russian hoax and all that good stuff. And I said, yeah, he needs to knock it down a notch. So we introduced legislation, myself, Senator Tillis, Senator Grassley, with Democrats, to let the president know that we believe Special Counsel Mueller should be allowed to do his job, and you shouldn't fire him or any other special counsel unless you have cause. The president believes he and his family were abused by the system. He's pissed off. He thought the whole thing was a hoax. I listened to what he had to say, but I trusted Mueller to do his job. We were able to get Mueller to conclusion. Now, once we find out that the Mueller investigation was run by people who hated Trump's guts, dripping with partisanship, nobody seems to care. Well, we can't figure out if their hatred for Trump had any effect on their actions. Well, I don't think you have to be that smart to put the puzzle together, but we're going to keep trying. And Mr. Horowitz said he didn't know if the senior top-level officials of the FBI knew about the subsource disavowing the document, but that's something you would want to know. It matters to me whether or not the number 2 guy at the FBI, Comey himself, knew the document was no longer reliable and kept using it. And you can't answer that question. None of you can. But I'm going to get the answer to that question. And I want to find out why they kept going after Flynn when everybody who'd looked at Flynn said he shouldn't be part of Crossfire Hurricane. We're going to have to do that by ourselves. Y'all could care less. This really says a lot, I think, not good about this committee. But having said that, we're going to go wherever the evidence takes us, and I'm going to try to answer some basic questions about how I got so off the rails and try to explain to the public why the FISA court was so upset. And I don't know if anybody's going to go to jail. People went to jail in the Mueller investigation. Well, I think there's some people who are real good candidates for going to jail for manipulating the FISA application process and abusing the rule of law. So we're going to keep going, and the reason I'm doing this, you've made it abundantly clear you don't agree with what I'm doing. You think I'm in Trump's pocket. I get all of that. It's not lost on me of what you think. And I'm sad because I like you all. But to expect me to punt, you can forget it. We're not going to punt. We're not going to have a rule of law for Republicans and a rule of law for Democrats, where it's okay to turn the Republican nominee's life upside down. And when you find out there was abuses in that system, not to ask questions how that happened and make sure it never happens again to anybody. So we're gonna keep pressing forward, and the reason I'm doing Subpoena is because it's clear to me you're not gonna help me. And it gives me the authority to do what I think I need to do. And Senator Lay, in 2008, I'm gonna introduce for the record your subpoena motion is virtually exactly the same. You'd come to conclude that there were times when the Republicans wouldn't go where you wanted to go on torture. And you were right, because every Republican voted no. I just now know up front, I'd be an idiot to believe that you're going to help me. You're not. And you can fight. And if you want to hear from Mueller, we'll hear from Mueller. You want to know why Flynn's case was dropped? I want to know too. I promise you they'll have to come in here and answer that. But off we go. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I say this to my Republican colleagues, but also to my Democratic friends. We've all read the Horowitz report. Something's clearly wrong with respect to the FISA warrant process. Less noticed, but perhaps more important, was a follow-up by Mr. Horowitz after he did a audit of other FISA applications. And he found an equal number, actually many more, abuses. Maybe that's too pejorative. Let's settle on mistakes. It seems to me that one of two things are going on. Number one, and I hope we don't find this, that some folks at the FBI have political opinions. My guess is they all do. You don't want to hire anybody to an important position if they haven't thought about the world and have a perspective about it. But we may find that not only did some people at the FBI and perhaps at the Department of Justice have political opinions, but they acted on it. And I would remind, not that I need to, but I think it's worth noting, my Democratic friends, that Mr. Comey investigated not one presidential campaign, but 2 presidential campaigns. And some have argued that his conduct, his behavior impacted the election results for Secretary Clinton. I wouldn't mind knowing about that either. So one possibility is bias and action upon that bias. The other possibility is arrogance. I don't think I've been here. I think I've been here a shorter period of time than anybody. Kamala and I came in together, but I think she beat me a few days. But one of the things I've noticed is that for some members of this town, their point of view is power corrupts, and absolute power is kind of cool. And we've got a system here where a member of the bureaucracy, I don't use that term in a pejorative sense, can go in front of a court in secret, which based on the statistics is a pretty compliant court, and get a warrant without me knowing about it, and they can open my mail, they can bug my bedroom, they can bug my house, they can follow me around, they can probably take my DNA. I mean, I think it's bad enough that Facebook and Google know everything about us. Maybe not, well, maybe including our DNA. But here we have an agency that we have given that authority to do the same thing. And we need to find out what happened. And that's why I voted for Senator Lee's amendments. We were all told, at least on our side of the aisle, I don't know about y'all's, but on our side of the aisle, we were told that if we voted for Senator Lee's amendments, that the world would spin off its axis. And we would see the end of Western order. Well, that didn't happen, and I like his amendments and the others who offered them, and I'm hoping we get that worked out. But it's not enough. And we ought to both work together to find out what's happening here. It's not a criticism of the FBI as an institution, but something is going on over there. And I think this is just one person's point of view, and then I'm going to shut up, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not going to say another word. I believe I believe those who were involved in this, either through political bias and action upon it, or breathtaking arrogance, are going to try to blame all this on some junior G-man or G-woman in the basement of the FBI building with green eye shades. And they're going to say it's all his fault or all her fault, and we didn't know anything about it. I don't believe that. I think it was either bias or arrogance, and we got to find out, folks, and I hope we can do it together.
Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, this week in Washington, D.C., something happening of constitutional moment, consequence. Within the jurisdiction of this committee. The President of the United States of America suggested federal militarization of law enforcement in the United States. This is not a minor suggestion. It's serious business. To think that federal troops would move into our cities and take control of law enforcement, this is a matter that we ought to be very concerned about. To the point where, if you followed it, the Secretary of Defense apparently nodded in favor of the President's position and then yesterday reversed himself. And others are doing the same thing because they realize that the President's suggestion was downright dangerous under our Constitution. This is within the jurisdiction of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we are doing and saying nothing. Nothing. Instead, we are reflecting on a report released by Mr. Mueller more than 1 year ago. Is it the intent of the Democrats to cover up the wrongdoing in that report? Not at all. I think we've all made it very clear that what happened to at least one individual in this report was just plain wrong. And to Senator Kennedy's point, it really does get to the heart of the FISA process. I want to thank Senator Leahy. Senator Lee, I've been on this crusade with them for 16 years, but I've been holding Senator Leahy's coat because he's done it so well. And I want to thank Senator Lee for joining him on a bipartisan basis. I'm not trying to cover up or conceal what's happening in FISA courts. It's about time the American people knew the abuse that took place during the Mueller investigation, but also the abuses we don't even have the first clue about. Senator Kennedy, I think the score is like 98-2 before that court in terms of compliance by the court when their request is made. Wouldn't you love to have a judge like that in a court you went to when you were practicing law?
I had judges like that, but I was the two.
Well, in this case, we know that when it comes to FISA reform, we had our chance, ladies and gentlemen, in the last few weeks. And a number of us joined with the Leahy-Lee approach, and a number of us voted against the FISA bill, even with that amendment in it, because we don't think it went far enough. So if this is about FISA reform, we had our moment. We can have another if you wish. But what gets me about this is I don't think it is. Mr. Chairman, I don't think it is.
No, it is not about FISA reform.
No, it clearly isn't. I think that you have a passion about this that is singular and not just personal because the President shares it, but it belies the reality. We have not been trying to conceal what happened during the course of the Mueller report. Inspector General Horowitz spent 19 months reviewing the FBI investigation, 170 interviews, reviewed 1 million documents, and wrote a 434-page report that was released last December. It made clear that FBI's Crossfire Hurricane counterintelligence investigation was opened for an authorized purpose, had adequate factual predication, and was not influenced by bias. I don't know of anyone who tried to stop the Inspector General in his effort, and I certainly don't want to diminish it today. But to say that the Democrats are turning a blind eye to the shortcomings of the Mueller report is just plain wrong. It's just plain wrong. It doesn't reflect reality. But instead, Mr. Chairman, what troubles me and why I support the motion, I'm afraid ill-fated motion by Senator Feinstein, is we're about to do something in this committee that is painful. Senator Leahy has explained what happened years ago on the torture issue, and you remember through our mutual friend John McCain what this Senate went through in those days. It was a rare moment, and the battle went on for years and years and years. And yet what we're being asked to do today is to give authority to this chairman that really is going to put an official end to the bipartisan comedy which has been part of this committee forever. That is unfortunate. And the list of 53, how do we happen to have the campaign manager for Joe Biden's presidential campaign on that list? I'm afraid it's very obvious. This is about a president who just can't get over it, maybe he never will, and by a chairman who wants him to have another day to make his point about how he was mistreated.
Yeah, with all due respect, I don't buy what you're saying at all.
I didn't expect you to.
Well, you know, here's the deal, Senator Durbin. For 2.5 years, the Trump campaign was looked at. Did they collude with the Russians? What do we know now? The Democratic Party nominee, through Fusion GPS, spent over $100,000 hiring a foreign British agent who found a Russian who provided Mr. Steele a bunch of garbage against candidate Trump that wound up being used by a FISA court multiple times to get a warrant against an American citizen.
Mr. Chairman, that is your theory.
No, that's a fact.
You're entitled to your
These
theory.
are facts.
When you stepped out yesterday,
These are
when
facts.
you stepped out yesterday, Mr. Rosenstein was asked twice whether the Steele dossier, which raises the blood pressure of Republicans by 40 points every time the name's mentioned, had nothing to do with the conclusion of the Mueller report. The substance of the
Would you
Mueller
please,
report.
you know, with all due respect, Senator Durbin, the dossier was the key document to get a warrant, without which there would be no warrant. If you don't believe me, ask Mr. Horowitz.
And the net result of it was with no impact on
You're trying to change the topic. Here's the topic. Is Senator Kennedy right? Did this whole debacle happen because some person, one or two low-level agents, knew that it was a bunch of garbage and didn't tell anybody and just misled the whole system, and McCabe and Comey are innocent victims? I am absolutely confident that it is impossible to believe that one of the most prominent investigations in the history of the FBI, a sitting president, that when the case fell apart, nobody found out about it. That they interviewed the man 3 times in January, once in March, and once in May, and he disavowed the entire document used to get a warrant, and it never worked its way up to the top. Isn't that a fascinating concept, that it could be just this 1 or 2 people down at the bottom? We're going to find out that, and if it is, so be it. But I can promise you this is a big deal to us. The Mueller investigation was a big deal for the country. We need to know, was the president, was the nominee of the Republican Party a Russian agent? We looked, $30 million, subpoena after subpoena. Now we need to know, did the Democratic Party hire a foreign agent to find a Russian stooge to dupe the FISA court? And did the FBI know about it, and did they play along with it? We're going to find that out. If we have to do it by ourselves, we're going to find it out. Senator Cruz.
Senator, may I conclude? Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, may I conclude?
Yes, you may.
Your personal feelings on this are very clear, and you've expressed them over and over. We know where this committee is headed. I don't believe this is a priority or timely. You do, and that you're the chairman. You've got the votes. But I do believe what Senator Feinstein has asked for is not unreasonable, that there be some sort of bipartisan comedy and collaboration in this effort, as there has been in the history of this committee. The second thing is I'll be offering amendments, as other members will, that if you found 53 witnesses that you'd like to hear from, we've got 10 or 11 we'd like to hear from who have personal knowledge of the facts that you're talking about, but were somehow omitted from the list that you produced. So I'll leave it at that and support Senator Feinstein.
Mr. Chairman, before you go to Senator Cruz, can we get a sense of how long we're going to be here?
Yeah.
Because some of us have other committees, and with all due respect, I don't think anybody in private ever disagrees with me when I say it's bullshit the way people grandstand for cameras in here. The reality is, if we didn't have cameras in this room, the discussion would be different. The Senate doesn't work. It doesn't diffuse the partisan tensions that are leading the country toward dissolution. I'm for transparency. I'm for print reporters being everywhere. I'm for audio transcripts being everywhere. But 90% of our committees are about people trolling for sound bites. That's what actually happens. So some of us have other work to do. People can troll for sound bites whenever they want, but can we at least have a sense of when we're going to take our votes so people can come back?
Yes, Senator Sass, I don't think they're trolling for sound bites. I think they're genuinely upset with what I'm doing.
Criticism here is bipartisan.
Yeah, well, and I don't think I'm trolling for a soundbite. I'm trying to defend what I think we need to be doing as chairman. There happens to be a TV camera. I think we'd be having the same conversation if there wasn't a television camera. So, no, I find the whole concept offensive. Well, that's your right. If you got to go somewhere else, go. We're going to do what this committee needs to do, and we're going to fight it out, and we're going to vote, and we're not going to be done. Excuse me. We're not going to be done today, so I don't see a resolution this day. If you need to go somewhere, go. But we're going to let our colleagues talk on that side, and we're going to let Senator Cruz talk, and we're going to vote on all these motions. And I think the best thing for us to do is carry this over next week so we can have a full discussion, because we're going to vote at 11:40.
I happen
on the floor.
I happen to agree with the chairman, and let me say why. When he talks about the debate, I'm sure Mr. Sass is very concerned in getting his point through, and he's done that. But I would point out, long before we had TV in this room, I was here in hearings and meetings like this that would go on way into the evening with debates back and forth. Now, you and I have disagreed on things. In fact, I will not go into my religion and what I thought was an attack on my religion once in this committee, but we would have debates that would go on well into the evening, and there is no radio, there's no TV, there's just somebody taking the notes. There may have been some print press, and at the end, we were a better committee and a better Senate for it.
I'm for debate. I don't think we do debate.
Senator Cruz.
Well, political posturing is not new to the Senate, but even given that, this morning's protestations from the Democratic side of the aisle have been remarkable. the subpoenas at issue here are not about the Mueller report. It's not even about Carter Page or General Flynn. The central question here is about corruption and abuse of power. What has been made public is we now know that the previous administration directed the FBI, the CIA, law enforcement, and intelligence to target their political opposition. This committee has now heard testimony that not only did they authorize wiretaps of a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, not only did they send in spies wearing a wire to try to monitor their opponents, not only did they intercept phone calls from a three-star general who was the incoming national security advisor to the new president, not only did they fraudulently create evidence, altering emails from the CIA to the FBI. This is the FBI committing a felony of creating fake evidence because the FBI asked the CIA, was Carter Page working with you and helping the CIA? The CIA said yes, and the FBI lawyer fraudulently altered that email and turned yes into no, which if anyone else did that in any court in America, they would be put in jail for a long time for fraud. But we also know that this was not authorized. I think Senator Kennedy's right. There are a lot of people that want to blame this on some low-level lawyer 9 levels down. Here's the problem. We know that this went quite literally all the way to the top. January 5th, 2017. This is after the presidential election. This is after the whole world is shocked that Hillary Clinton didn't win, and oh my goodness, Donald Trump is getting ready to be president. Now, normally on January 5th, at the end of a presidential term, people are packing up and getting ready to leave. But what are they doing in this White House? January 5th, Oval Office meeting, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. And what are they talking about? Surveillance directed at the incoming national security advisor. What do we know now also? Sally Yates, the acting attorney general, was surprised. What do you mean? What are you talking about, Michael Flynn? Well, it turns out James Comey, the FBI director, was directly briefing President Obama. Sally Yates has said she learned about it from Barack Obama. Picture this for a second. The acting attorney general of the United States has no idea that our law enforcement is surveilling and targeting a 3-star general who is the incoming national security advisor. But the president knows. Why was Jim Comey briefing Barack Obama directly on the targeting of their political opponent? Senior senator from California asked, why is Jacob Lew on this list? Why is Samantha Power on this list? Because every damn one of them unmasked Michael Flynn, put in multiple orders. These are senior political players in the White House and the Obama administration. They're on their way out the door. They get along. They get masked intercepts that protect the privacy and hide a U.S. citizen, and they put in request after request after request. By the way, Joe Biden put in that request also. Why are they trying to unmask Michael Flynn? January 5th was the day after the FBI on January 4th had concluded there's no basis to investigate Michael Flynn. We're going to close the case. And by the way, they didn't just say it. They prepared the report saying, we're closing the case because there's no evidence here. Because we interviewed everyone, and there's no derogatory evidence. There's no basis to be targeting this guy, who is the incoming national security advisor for the president. January 4th is when the FBI says to close it. January 5th, there's James Comey in the Oval Office saying, we're going after him. We're going after Michael Flynn. And by the way, 15 days later, January 20th, look, there is in this room probably 500 years of government experience. I encourage all of you, pick up and read the Susan Rice email. Number one, it's January 20th, 2017. Everyone here knows what that date means. It's the very last day of the Obama administration. There's a new guy getting sworn in on the steps of the Capitol. We were all sitting there. Apparently, while we were sitting there, anyone else in a White House, and a lot of people here have been involved in White Houses of outgoing administrations, you're packing up your stuff. You're taking down the picture of your wife or your husband from the wall. You're putting your personal belongings in a box and you're leaving. It's not what Susan Rice is doing. She's sitting down typing an email. An email to whom? Herself. How often do you email yourself? Is that something you do a lot? Dear me, as you're leaving a job. She emails herself and writes this memo, which in the annals of government is one of the funniest damn memos you'll ever read. Dear me, the investigation of Michael Flynn is by the book. Let me be clear, it's by the book. Did I mention it's by the book? 3 times she uses the phrase by the book. Any of you ever played poker? There's something called a tell. When someone's writing over, this is by the book, we're not doing anything wrong, that's a big indication they're scared they're doing something wrong. The only reason she writes that email is she's sitting there going, oh crap, in about an hour, these next guys are going to arrive and they might find out that we turned the FBI into the personal research arm of the DNC. Look, all of them thought Hillary was going to win. Nobody would know that they had abused law enforcement and intelligence to target their political enemies. She writes this memo. By the way, ain't nothing by the book if on January 4th they say we're closing the investigation because there's no evidence. And January 5th, the FBI director is in the Oval Office with the president saying, hey, we're going after the guy. There's no book that lays that out. And what's astonishing is not a single Democrat here cares. Not a one of you is troubled. Or at least you won't say it publicly. No, I get it. It's an election year. Joe Biden's your nominee. For God's sakes, you don't want to uncover something that shows that Joe Biden was part of corruption. Barack Obama, I get it, you revere. You don't want to reveal that he was involved in the corruption, and you can't reveal Joe Biden was. So yesterday's hearing, we got Rod Rosenstein, the number 2 guy at DOJ, who on every answer is like, I didn't know. I didn't know. No, I didn't know that. No, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know what I was signing was completely false. And what was amazing about the questions from the Democrats is none of y'all cared. You're just like, oh, let's ask about something else. Let's ask, no, don't talk about this. Look, this committee ought to care, and let's be clear, we had a lot of talk about if the shoe were on the other foot. Pause for a second and imagine how you would feel if Donald J. Trump was doing exactly what Barack Obama and Joe Biden did. So right now, you guys copacetic with Trump putting wiretaps on the Joe Biden presidential campaign? Everything cool if Trump has the FBI send in agents wearing wires to the Joe Biden campaign? That's all good. Everything all right if they fraudulently create evidence. They doctor emails from the CIA and send it to a court under oath. No problem there? This is an absolute outrage and abuse of power. And by the way, to be clear, because I'm sure someone on Twitter will say, now Cruz has called for using the FBI to go after Joe Biden. No, to the contrary. Law enforcement and intelligence ought to be apolitical. We should enforce the law regardless of party, and this committee ought to be deeply concerned. It's not about revisiting the Mueller report. Was there a partisan, deliberate decision that we're going to use the machinery of government to go after and target our political opponents? Because there's more and more evidence that looks like it was, and that ought to concern everyone on this committee, because I guarantee you what one administration abuses, another administration is going to abuse, and that is dangerous for this country.
Okay, Senator Whitehouse and Harris, I know everybody wants to talk. I think the best thing to do is let Senator Whitehouse and Harris speak. They've been patient. We will hold over Senator Feinstein's motion. I think you have other motions. And we'll take this up next week so we can go on about our business. And this is an important discussion for the committee and the country. And we'll get to conclusion next week, and we'll take up the legislation Senator Lee has been pushing about the oversight of the Attorney General's office. So, and I promise everybody will get to speak.
Senator Harris.
But yes, Whitehouse, Harris. Then can we adjourn to next week, or do y'all want to speak? I promise you'll be right on deck. Senator Whitehouse?
I'm about to speak, so I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, start speaking.
Okay. First, Chairman, thank you for the way you're handling this discussion. I think that is actually consistent with the best traditions of the committee, and I appreciate it. I think you know, and I think everybody in the room knows, of my affection and admiration for you, and I have considerable affection or admiration, or both, for a considerable number of my colleagues on the Republican side of this committee. I do think that there are legitimate questions that need to be asked and answered. I also think that we are on the precipice of falling into a political errand. And which way we choose to go in this committee is going to have huge ramifications in the future. As we go forward, it is impossible for me to consider this unique exercise of committee oversight without considering the background of no committee oversight on many other important questions. I went through yesterday 17 Department of Justice witnesses under Rod Rosenstein who refused to or failed to answer a single QFR from any senator on this committee. 17. That's not an oversight. That's a policy. And we as a committee, if we won't even defend our own ability to pursue questions for the record, we have emasculated ourselves. We have made ourselves preposterous. That is not a good sign when against that background, now suddenly, we have an investigative interest. There are multiple letters that have been ignored on multiple subjects. I just focused yesterday on the QFRs. I could go separately through a list of letters. We heard preposterous privilege assertions in this committee, ones that stood on no legal foundation, and we not only did not pursue those assertions, we didn't even have a hearing to determine what a legitimate privilege assertion is. I believe the FBI took a dive in the Kavanaugh investigation and set up a fake tip line that they never reviewed and never followed their own agency procedures on. My questions have been just thrown into a bin. No answer, ignored. I believe that the FBI previously tanked a civil RICO investigation into corporate fraud. No questions, no answers, stiffed. My questions into the bin. $35 million spent by one or two donors to influence the makeup of the United States Supreme Court, and we don't know who that donor was? That is a preposterous state of affairs, and yet we've taken no interest. So there's something a little bit questionable to me. There's a little bit of a red flag fluttering when I see this as the only exercise of committee oversight in so long. It is also hard to overlook the congruence of this particular instance of committee oversight with the interests of the president's campaign. And when you flag onto that a person from the Biden campaign is a listed witness, again, another red flag begins to fly. It is impossible for me to overlook the bad example of the House Intelligence Committee. It is my belief that if a proper and full investigation were made, we would find that the obstruction of justice that Mueller found to have taken place in his investigation involved House members who colluded with Trump's lawyers to participate in that obstruction of justice. I may be right, I may be wrong, but it is a predicated belief, I would say, and we should be looking at it. And what it did, if I'm right, is that it trained the Trump White House to come to members of Congress and make us their political agents. If they pulled it off with the House Intelligence Committee, they have every incentive, indeed they have been rewarded and trained to try to do it with us. Another red flag. And it's also hard not to notice the start that this got off to yesterday and today. There's been a lot of talk about playing for the cameras, but I would hazard that a good deal of what has been said in this committee already has been trying to push this into a partisan political narrative rather than to pursue the dispassionate pursuit of truth that would be a reassurance that the asking and answering of legitimate questions is where we're going on this. Again, another red flag. I wrote my friend Senator Graham a letter that I presaged yesterday, and I'd like to ask that the letter be made a record of this markup today. And what I asked for is that there be enforceable assurances, sincere and enforceable assurances that this investigation will not be advised, directed, or controlled by the White House. I think that's reasonable and fair. Also, assurances that this investigation will not be advised, directed, or controlled by the Trump campaign. I think that is reasonable and fair. Assurances that witnesses will not be called or subpoenaed selectively to produce only one side of the story, and in that regard, to allow minority witnesses to be called. To see to it that witness interviews and document reviews are both fair and bipartisan. That if you're going to get a look at documents, we get a look at documents. That this is done as a committee and not just as the Republicans on the committee, even if that's the way the vote breaks out. That we assure that document production will be complete and not orchestrated with the White House or the Trump campaign to produce a selective package of documents and not all relevant documents. And finally, that information, when the committee releases it, will not be released selectively and will not be orchestrated with the White House or the Trump campaign. Those, I think, are very fair, sensible, responsible guardrails that should guide whatever inquiry we pursue. And I urge that we consider those as we go forward to make sure that on the precipice between legitimate questions that need to be asked and answered and turning this committee into a political errand runner for the Trump campaign, we stay on the right side, on the fair, bipartisan, asking and answering questions side of that precipice. And if I may make one final factual point, just because it illustrates how narrative building has taken over dispassionate inquiry here. It has been repeatedly mentioned that the Obama administration was surveilling the National Security Advisor, and that is why he was recorded. I believe that the facts of the matter are that our intelligence community was surveilling the Russian ambassador, which it is their job to do. And in their surveillance of the Russian ambassador, guess what? They picked up a call from the president's national security advisor. Everybody here who has done search warrants knows the difference between the target of a search warrant and a person who calls in to a targeted surveillance. If we are misrepresenting that, then we're off to a really bad start as to whether we're trying to ask and answer real questions or whether we're trying to run a political narrative and a political errand. And by the way, if you are the intelligence community or the FBI and you pick up a conversation when you are surveilling the Russian ambassador with the National Security Advisor, and you know the National Security Advisor said something because you have it from your surveillance, and then the Vice President of the United States says the exact opposite, misleads the American public because he was lied to by the National Security Advisor, if you don't see that that creates a potential national security problem, a counterintelligence problem, then I think you need to go back to intelligence school and figure out how counterintelligence and international pressure systems work. So please, I was so proud when I came onto this committee when I got here. And there were titans of the Senate on both sides when I got here. Please, let's make sure that whatever we do stays on the side of honor and decency and fairness here, and that we do not replicate the experience of the House Intelligence Committee and allow ourselves to become political errand boys for political campaigns. That is what I ask.
Thank you, and I know you sincerely asked that. I can tell you sincerely, I joined efforts with your colleagues to make sure Mr. Mueller could do his job when it came to President Trump, because I thought it was important. I have that same passion to try to find out, is this all some little guy, little gal down in the bowels of the basement of the FBI, or is it something higher? And you're right, Kislyak was being monitored lawfully by our government. But I'm really concerned about unmasking the incoming National Security Advisor by the outgoing administration. And if I find out that the government is listening to my conversations with the Kurds, where I'm taking on Trump or Bibi or anybody else, I'll be upset, because we're a separate branch of government. This is dangerous stuff when you start making unmasking requests to find out what the incoming administration is talking about.
And Mr. Chairman, a quick point, as I understand it, the conversation with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador that became the subject of the subsequent case and prosecution, that particular conversation, there's not an unmasking request. And the reason an unmasking request comes if you've got a CIA intercept, you've got an intelligence community intercept, that would be what would typically be applied to the Russian ambassador, and a U.S. citizen is masked. And my understanding is the fact that there's not an unmasking for that call suggests it wasn't CIA who intercepted it, but rather that it was FBI who intercepted it. And I think there is a very real possibility that FBI was targeting Flynn. I'd love to find out if that wasn't true. That's part of why we actually need these subpoenas.
Yeah, I think that is a distinction that would matter. Senator Harris, the very patient Senator Harris.
I try. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Judiciary Committee has as one of its very important responsibilities to concern itself with the system of justice in America. Well, today a man by the name of George Floyd will be honored, his memory will be honored at a funeral. He died because the knee of a police officer was on his neck for over 8 minutes while he pled for his life, called for his late mother, and said he can't breathe. America is raw right now, if this committee is to think of its relevance at this moment, I would dare say the conversation we are having today is irrelevant to what is happening on the streets of America today. We are looking at people in pain, people by the thousands of every race, age, and geographic location, shouting for justice in America. Yet this committee doth protest too much, as Shakespeare might say, on an issue that is not relevant to the people and the pain that America is feeling today. The wounds that we are feeling are deepened by a president of the United States who has fanned the flames of hurt and pain. Civil rights and matters involving law enforcement are this committee's responsibility, this committee alone. And instead of engaging in political partisan games on behalf of this president, what the American people need this committee to do is be relevant to why they are shouting and marching and crying in the streets of our country. They need us to address the real issue of police brutality and implicit bias within law enforcement. They need us to address Donald Trump and Attorney General Barr's assault on our citizens' constitutional rights of free expression and peaceful assembly. They need us to address the disbelief that former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis expressed in seeing our nation's troops being ordered to, quote, violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens. They need us to talk about the lives that have been taken from us. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and so many more. This committee meeting today sends a message to millions of Americans that have taken to the streets to protest this violence, that this Judiciary Committee doesn't care. This committee has a duty to confront these issues, Mr. Chairman, and an obligation to address the pain that people are feeling, the suffering they feel. And by shying away from this responsibility, this committee will not only dishonor the body that we serve, but it will dishonor the very memory of those that we should be naming today. And Mr. Chairman, I have in particular an amendment offered by myself and Senator Booker, and it relates to the fact that on Monday, peaceful demonstrators were gathered in front of the White House to protest the murder of George Floyd. They were violently forced out by federal law enforcement. Shortly thereafter, it was reported that Attorney General Barr personally ordered their forceful removal. And obviously, the protection of civil rights and liberties falls squarely within the responsibility of the jurisdiction of this committee. And so I am offering an amendment that this committee not issue any subpoenas under authority of this motion until this committee has conducted a thorough investigation and held a hearing to examine the conduct of Attorney General Barr on June 1st, 2020, when he reportedly ordered federal law enforcement personnel to remove peaceful protesters who were engaged in constitutionally protected activity.
Thank you. With the pending business for the committee, Senator Feinstein's motion, I promised Senator Harris and Booker that when we get back, we'll take this up Thursday. We will vote on your amendment. We're going to get the subpoena debate behind us, but I think it's best to carry it over so we can talk, and this is an important issue. As to what the committee will be doing on June 16th, we're going to have a hearing about policing and race and a bunch of things, about how hard it is to fire a bad cop. Why is it that if you're a young black person, man, and the cops pull up behind you, you get really worried, and I don't. Tim Scott's been stopped 6 times on Capitol Hill. I've never been stopped. There is a line of thinking on Fox News I saw that there were only 10 African-American unarmed men who died in police custody, and that's at the lowest level possible. That's not the issue. The issue is that why is it that if you're an African-American teenager or male in general, you see the cops behind you, it's a different experience than if the cops are behind me. I don't know. I mean, the point is, enough with the conversation. It's got to be had, but got to do something about it. There's got to be better policing methods available to the country than currently exist. I'm willing to spend a lot of money to get the system to engage in better policing. I'm willing to make it easier to fire bad cops who shouldn't be wearing the uniform to begin with. Count me in for solutions. We're going to have the conversation. It's going to start June 16th, but I think this committee has the potential to reinforce things in society that will lead to better policing. And hopefully one day, if you're a young black man and the cops pull up behind you, you'll be wondering if you were going too fast rather than you're going to get beat up. That's the goal. We'll see you next week. Thank you.